Story 1. The wind blew strong that cloudy morning, bringing with it a sense of unease. John, a 38-year-old gravedigger, had felt it since the early hours. The cemetery where he had worked for nearly 20 years seemed different that day, as if the very ground held secrets that should remain hidden. He had witnessed many dark stories unfold in this place, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. As he lowered the coffin of a recently deceased woman into the grave, something caught his attention. Something was out of place. It wasn't uncommon for relatives to leave flowers or personal items in the coffin before burial, but this time, John noticed something that made his heart race: scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid. He froze. Could it be a cruel joke? A grotesque mistake? Or something far more terrifying? John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he had to proceed with the burial, but the thought of burying someone alive paralyzed him. Could it be possible? What if she hadn't been dead when they put her in the coffin? His mind raced, searching for explanations, but none could calm his growing dread. What lay before him was physical evidence of something that only existed in nightmares. His first call was to his boss, the one responsible for overseeing the burials. The response was almost automatic: "That happens sometimes. It's likely due to the body's gases. Just continue with the burial." The technical explanation didn't convince him. John had seen bodies decomposing before, but never had he seen anything like this. He glanced again at the scratch marks, and this time, he felt a pit in his stomach. Something was terribly wrong. Later, John went to the cemetery office and searched for the death certificate. He discovered that the woman, aged 35, had been declared dead after a car accident. Her body had been transferred directly from the hospital to the morgue without further verification. The discomfort in him grew. What if something had been overlooked? That's when John decided to act. He couldn't just bury this woman without being certain. Even at the risk of losing his job, he knew he had to do something. With trembling hands and a racing heart, he grabbed his phone and called the hospital, hoping to find some information that would reassure him. The voice on the other end of the line at the hospital was cold and bureaucratic. John tried to explain what he had seen, but received a standard, almost indifferent response. "Sir, the patient was declared dead by a doctor. All procedures were followed correctly. There's nothing to discuss." The call ended abruptly, leaving John feeling more helpless than ever. He hung up the phone, but the sense of dread didn't leave him. He needed help, someone who could confirm his suspicions. That's when he remembered Matt, an old childhood friend who worked as a coroner in a nearby town. John called him, his voice tense and urgent. "Matt, I've found something strange here at the cemetery. I need you to come as fast as you can." Matt, who knew John well, could tell something very serious was happening. "Okay, I'm on my way. But tell me, what exactly did you find?" John took a deep breath before describing the scratch marks on the coffin. The line went silent for a few seconds, and then Matt's voice came back, more serious this time. "This is serious. I'll be there in less than an hour." While waiting, John started to replay the details of the day the woman's body had arrived at the cemetery. He hadn't noticed anything unusual at first, but now his mind began to revisit every small detail. Why were the relatives so quiet? Why did the funeral feel rushed, almost as if they were trying to get rid of something? Nothing seemed to add up. Finally, Matt arrived at the cemetery. Wearing his white lab coat and with a serious expression on his face, he walked over to the grave where the coffin was still visible. John pointed to the marks, and Matt crouched down to examine them closely. He studied the scratches for a few minutes before turning to John. "These marks are recent. And there's more. Look at this." He pointed to a small crack on the coffin lid. Someone tried to get out. The silence between them was suffocating. John felt a knot tighten in his throat. His worst fears were being confirmed. "We need to open the coffin," Matt said, in a tone that left no room for argument. With trembling hands, John grabbed a screwdriver and began removing the screws that sealed the coffin shut. The metallic sound echoed in the heavy air of the cemetery, and each click seemed to amplify the tension between them. When the last screw was finally undone, John and Matt exchanged glances. They were about to uncover something they would never forget. As they lifted the lid, the sight before them was horrifying. The woman's body lay there, motionless, but her face was twisted in a look of absolute terror. Her fingers were raw, covered in dried blood, as if she had fought desperately to escape. The sight was unbearable. John stepped back, feeling the world around him collapse. She was alive, Matt. My God, John's mind struggled to process the reality in front of him. But before they could do anything, a disturbing sound filled the air, the ringing of a cell phone coming from inside the coffin. They both stared at each other in shock. John looked at the phone lying beside the woman's body, its screen flashing with a new WhatsApp message. Shaking, he picked up the device, and what he read made his blood run cold. You shouldn't have opened it. The screen went black immediately, leaving them in terrifying silence. The shock paralyzed both men. The message on the screen made no sense, but the fear it instilled was undeniable. Matt, always the more rational of the two, tried to compose himself. This must be a prank. Someone probably left the phone in there by mistake. But his voice lacked the confidence he was trying to convey. John, on the other hand, was completely terrified. He looked around, half expecting something even worse to happen at any moment. The wind continued to howl, making the trees around them seem like they were whispering dark secrets. The sound of the phone still echoed in his mind, and the image of the scratch marks and the woman's twisted face lingered, haunting him. It can't just be a coincidence, Matt, John said, his voice shaking. And that message? How could someone know? It was sent just now, while we were here. How could this be a joke? Matt had no answers. Even with all his experience, he knew that something was terribly wrong, something beyond their control. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he picked up the woman's phone and checked the message history. The last conversation she had was with an unknown number, and the exchange of messages revealed something even more disturbing. The woman had been in an intense argument with someone, a mysterious person who was threatening her life, saying that her fate was sealed. Matt read the messages aloud, trying to make sense of it. But what he found only deepened the mystery. You won't escape me, read one of the last messages. Your end is already decided. The strangest part, however, was the timestamp of the messages. They had been sent moments before her death in the car accident. How is this possible? These messages, they were sent while she was still alive, but no one knew about them until now. And the accident was reported as instant, Matt muttered, more to himself than to John. The realization that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding sank in. The fear was no longer just about burying someone alive. There was a sinister presence hovering over the cemetery, something or someone manipulating fate in a terrifying way. Before they could decide what to do, another unexpected sound interrupted them. The cemetery gate creaked open, revealing a figure slowly walking towards them. The tall, hooded silhouette moved steadily, without haste, but each step seemed to resonate through the ground. John and Matt exchanged panicked looks. What else could happen on this cursed day? John instinctively grabbed the screwdriver again, his only weapon, while Matt scanned the surroundings, searching for an escape. The figure finally stopped a few meters away from them, and then a low, almost inaudible voice cut through the wind. You shouldn't have disturbed what was already sealed. John's heart pounded. This person knew. They knew about the coffin, the scratch marks, the phone. They knew more than John and Matt could comprehend. Matt, usually calm, felt cold sweat running down his face. Who are you? What's happening here? The response was slow, filled with eerie certainty. Her fate was sealed, and now yours is too. Without another word, the figure turned and slowly disappeared into the thickening fog. The silence left in the air was suffocating. John and Matt stood there, motionless, unable to process what had just happened. Suddenly, both their phones vibrated at the same time. When they looked at their screens, a single message flashed on both devices. You won't escape either. It was as if a deadly cycle had been triggered, and now all that remained was the terrifying realization that something was hunting them, something they couldn't outrun. John's terror, once focused on saving the woman, now shifted to saving himself. The fear consumed them. Every second, the air grew heavier, as if the cemetery itself was closing in on them, trapping them in a veil of horror. John and Matt knew they couldn't stay, but where could they go? Who could they call? Everything felt like a trap, a web spun by something far beyond their understanding. We need to get out of here, Matt whispered, still unable to tear his eyes away from the phone screen, where the threatening message kept flashing. John, without hesitation, nodded. His hands were shaking as he packed up the tools, and he took one last look at the open coffin. The image of the woman's face, distorted in terror, would never leave his mind. They started walking away, their hurried, uneven footsteps echoing along the dirt path. The thick fog now blanketed the cemetery, making every movement feel labored, as if something unseen was watching them. As they neared the exit, they heard that unsettling sound again, the creak of the metal gate, but this time, no one was there. "Let's go!" John yelled, unable to bear the mounting tension any longer. They rushed to the car, their breathing heavy and panicked. Once inside, Matt turned the ignition with trembling hands. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said. "No one would believe us." John, sweating and exhausted, agreed. "But, what if they're right? What if we really are in danger?" The silence returned, filling the air between them. They both knew something had been unleashed that day, something that would haunt them, something that wouldn't stop until the cycle was complete. Matt's phone vibrated again. Another message. John watched with wide eyes as Matt, hesitating, read the new notification. "This time, there's no escape." Matt let out a frustrated shout and slammed on the gas, his hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The fog thickened around them, and the road seemed endless. Every turn they took, every street they tried, led them back to the cemetery. It was as if the very world around them was conspiring to keep them trapped in this nightmare. Hours passed, and they found themselves back at the same iron gate. John screamed in frustration, pounding the dashboard, while Matt stared at the entrance, now illuminated by a faint, ghostly light. The hooded figure stood there again, motionless, watching them from a distance. With no options left, no escape in sight, John and Matt knew they had been drawn into an inevitable fate. What had begun as a simple job for gravediggers had transformed into something far darker, a force beyond their control. And, in the end, they understood that the cycle that had started that day wouldn't end there. As the car's engine shut off on its own, the sound of another message vibrating filled the air. John closed his eyes, terror gripping every part of him. "This is it," he whispered, accepting the fate that awaited them. The final message glowed in the dark. "Welcome to hell." Story 2. It was a cold and silent autumn night in the small town of Westbridge. The wind blew softly, rustling the dry leaves of the old trees that surrounded the graveyard. Michael Anderson, the gravedigger who had worked there for more than 2 decades, was used to the mortal silence that ruled the place. For him, death had become routine. Digging graves, burying people, and closing caskets had turned into mechanical acts over the years. That morning, Michael had buried a man, Robert Harris, who had died suddenly at the age of 45. Rumors had spread throughout town that Robert's death was suspicious. Some said he had legal troubles, others whispered that he had dealings with dangerous people. But for Michael, those were just stories. His job was simple: dig, bury, and move on. Yet, that night, something strange hung in the air. As Michael finished locking up the small tool shed for the night, his phone vibrated. It was a message from his wife, Jennifer, asking when he would be home. "1 more hour, I'm almost done here," he replied quickly. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and started walking toward the gate, ready to call it a day. That's when he heard it. A faint sound, but distinct. It was like something was moving, dragging across the ground. Michael stopped and looked around, but everything seemed normal. Must be the wind, he thought, trying to ignore the chill that suddenly ran down his spine. But the sound came again, louder this time, like someone, or something, was pushing dirt. He frowned and followed the noise, which led him to the freshly dug grave of Robert Harris. To his horror, the earth was disturbed, and the coffin was tilted upward, as if someone had tried to get out. What? The sight was shocking. He could have sworn he had buried Robert earlier that morning. His hands began to tremble as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. This isn't possible," he stammered, heart racing. Michael looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could explain this. But the graveyard was empty. His mind raced through possibilities: a vandal? An animal? But none of them made sense. He cautiously approached the grave, still hesitant, and as he bent down to take a closer look, a cold wind blew through the air, as if death itself was watching him. Suddenly, Michael's phone buzzed again. With shaking hands, he pulled it from his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number: "He is not dead." Michael froze. The message seemed impossible, but there it was, glowing on his screen like a death sentence. He looked back at the disturbed grave, his heart pounding uncontrollably. What should he do now? Michael couldn't tear his eyes away from the message. He is not dead. It felt like a nightmare, but everything was real. The graveyard was empty and dark, and the cold was seeping deeper into his bones as fear crept in. He took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, typed back, "Who is this?" Without waiting for a response, Michael circled the grave, trying to figure out how the earth had been disturbed. He was certain Robert Harris had been buried properly that morning, and it was impossible for him to have gotten out on his own. The silence around him now felt suffocating. Suddenly, another message appeared on his screen. "Look for what is hidden." Michael felt his heart skip a beat. His hands were sweaty, and he almost dropped the phone. Hesitant, he glanced at the tilted coffin. Was the body still inside? A morbid impulse took over him, and he knew he had to check. "This is madness," he whispered to himself, but even so, he grabbed a nearby shovel and started removing the dirt that still covered part of the coffin. As he worked, thoughts raced through his mind. He knew there was no one else around, or at least, that's what he believed. But what if someone was watching him? What if someone, or something, was behind all this? His heart pounded faster with each strike of the shovel against the damp soil. When he finally managed to free the lid of the coffin, Michael felt his stomach churn. He knelt beside it, and with one final effort, he lifted the lid. The dull thud echoed through the graveyard. But the coffin was empty. Michael fell back, disbelief washing over him. He was certain, absolutely certain, that he had buried Robert there. How is this possible?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the night. The empty coffin seemed to mock him, as if this whole thing was some cruel joke. His phone buzzed again, startling him. "You were warned." Without thinking, Michael started to run. The cold air bit at his face as he sprinted, trying to escape the nightmare unfolding around him. He ran toward the cemetery's entrance, but the iron gate, which he was sure he had left unlocked, was now sealed shut. His panic intensified. Looking around, he spotted the small tool shed where he kept his supplies. With trembling hands, he ran to it and locked himself inside. His legs felt weak, and his breathing was erratic. Inside the shed, he calmed down for a moment, trying to make sense of everything. The empty coffin. The strange messages. Nothing made sense. When his phone buzzed again, he barely had the courage to look at it. The new message was brief, "It's close." Michael tried to reason. Someone was messing with him. Someone knew about the burial and was trying to scare him. Maybe it was revenge? But for what? He couldn't find any reasonable explanation. Then, he remembered something. Robert's family. Could they know anything? He quickly typed a message to the mysterious number. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The response came immediately. "You know who I am." A chill ran down Michael's spine as he read those words. The night seemed to close in around him, as if time itself was conspiring against him. His breathing grew heavier, and he realized he couldn't stay locked in the shed forever. He needed answers. Gathering his courage, he stepped outside and returned to the grave. This time, he was determined to understand what was happening, no matter the cost. Michael returned to the grave with heavy breaths, his heart pounding in his chest and the sensation of being watched growing stronger with every step. The graveyard, once a place of peaceful silence, now seemed full of secrets and shadows creeping in from every corner. The open coffin still lay there, a grim reminder that something was very, very wrong. As Michael approached the grave, his phone buzzed again. He hesitated before looking at the screen. The message read, "It's behind you." Suddenly, Michael heard the sound of heavy footsteps dragging along the dirt behind him. He spun around quickly, his breath catching in his throat. But there was no one there. "I'm losing my mind," he thought, trying to push down the rising panic. But then, the footsteps came again, clearer this time. Michael's heart raced as he began to move back toward the tool shed, but something made him stop. His eyes widened as he saw a figure emerging from the shadows, walking slowly between the graves. It was tall, hunched over, and dressed in black. "Robert," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure, which bore a striking resemblance to the man he had buried that morning, stood just a few feet away, its face obscured by the darkness. Michael tried to back away, but his legs were frozen in place, as if the ground itself was holding him down. The cold seemed to intensify around him, every breath he took forming thick clouds of vapor in the air. Then, the figure took another step forward, revealing a pale face with lifeless, empty eyes. It was Robert Harris, or at least, something that looked like him. You "You shouldn't be here," Michael shouted, his voice finally breaking the silence. Robert, or whatever that figure was, tilted its head, as if confused, and then, in a sudden, jerking motion, it stretched out a hand toward Michael. The gravedigger felt a chill run down his spine as he instinctively stepped back. But before he could move further, his phone buzzed again. Michael reluctantly glanced at the screen, knowing he shouldn't, but unable to resist. "Look behind you." Terror gripped his entire body. Michael knew he didn't want to turn around, but the sensation was inescapable. His muscles reacted as if they had a will of their own. Slowly, he turned his head to look over his shoulder, fear coursing through every inch of him. Behind him, emerging from the darkness, was a second figure. This time, the face was unfamiliar. A woman, pale with hollow eyes, dressed in white, was walking toward him. She, too, was dead. Michael couldn't comprehend what was happening. He was surrounded by bodies that were supposed to be buried, but now they were walking, breathing, or at least something close to that. There was nowhere for him to run. The two figures moved closer, slowly, as if they were savoring his fear, feeding on every second of his terror. Michael dropped to his knees, his phone slipping from his hands. He had never believed in ghost stories or spirits, but now, surrounded by the impossible, he didn't know what was real anymore. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the wind, which was now howling through the graveyard, scattering leaves and lifting dust. The phone buzzed one last time. "You cannot escape." Michael was frozen in terror. The two figures approached slowly, and he couldn't move, couldn't think. His mind was blank, and the only sound filling his ears was the echo of his heart beating wildly. The cold wind blew stronger, as if it wanted to carry him away, but he was trapped there, in the middle of a nightmare. Just as the figures came close enough for him to see the details of their lifeless faces, something unexpected happened. The sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. Michael, almost by reflex, looked down at the ground where his phone had fallen, but the sound wasn't coming from his phone. It was coming from one of the figures, the woman in white. She stopped, seeming confused, and the ringing continued. What followed was surreal. The woman reached into her pocket, pulled out a phone, and answered it. Michael watched in shock, unable to believe what was happening. The woman was silent for a few seconds, listening to whoever was on the other end, and then she whispered something that Michael couldn't hear. Robert, the other figure, stopped too. He turned his head toward the woman, as if waiting for a response. She lowered the phone, looked directly at Michael, and said, "He is here." Suddenly, the figures began to dissolve, like mist disappearing into the wind. The bodies, which had been so terrifyingly real just moments ago, were now fading before his eyes. Michael blinked, stunned. In seconds, they were gone, leaving the graveyard in complete silence once again. Still in shock, Michael slowly stood up. What had just happened? He looked around, hoping to see some sign of the figures or the mysterious messages, but there was nothing. The coffin remained there, open and empty, but now, everything felt normal, except for the fact that nothing made sense. When Michael picked up his phone from the ground, he noticed that all the messages had disappeared. The phone showed no record of the cryptic texts, as if everything had been a product of his terrified imagination. He ran from the graveyard, his heart still pounding in his chest. The feeling that something dark was still lurking followed him, but he didn't look back. Finally, he reached the gate, which was now unlocked. Without a second thought, Michael bolted out, leaving behind the graveyard and the secrets he never wanted to uncover. He didn't know if what he had seen was real or a product of his fear. And the truth, he realized, was that he might never know. When Michael got home, he collapsed into the kitchen chair, still trying to process everything that had happened. His wife, Jennifer, walked in, looking at him with concern. "Michael? Are you okay? You look pale." He looked at her, struggling to find the right words, but what could he say? That the dead had risen? That he had seen Robert Harris and another woman? No one would believe him. "Yeah, just a long day," he replied, unsure if he was telling the truth. Jennifer watched him for another moment before checking her phone. "Oh, I forgot to mention," she said, distracted. "I got a weird call earlier. No one was on the line, but I heard breathing." Michael froze. "When was that?" Jennifer looked at him, surprised by the urgency in his voice. "I'm not sure, maybe, just after dinner." "Why?" Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The same time he had been at the graveyard. the same time the figures had surrounded him. He didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain: what had happened that night would never be forgotten. Michael glanced out the window, where the cold night wind continued to blow. What he had seen at the graveyard could be explained in many ways, but one thing was undeniable: some things were better left buried. Story 3. In Oak Ridge County, there lay a cemetery as old as the town itself, with tombstones dating back centuries. The dense fog and cold wind created an air of solitude at the end of every day. Ethan Miller, a veteran graveyard keeper, tended to the place like a guardian of forgotten memories. He had always been a practical man, unimpressed by the ghost stories that circled the area. To him, what lay beneath the ground were just bodies. Nothing more. That night, however, something would change his view forever. It was nearly midnight. Ethan was finishing up covering one of the last graves for the day when he heard a distant sound. A whisper? Maybe just the wind rustling through the trees. He ignored it. Focused on his work, he moved his shovel with the precision of someone who had done this for years. But the sound returned, clearer now, closer. It was like a voice, weak and raspy. A chill ran down his spine. He paused, looking around and seeing what he didn't want to see: a pale figure moving among the gravestones, like a shadow that was slowly taking form. What was that? Ethan rubbed his eyes, convinced that he was just tired, that the thick fog was playing tricks on his mind. But no. The figure was there, becoming more real with each step it took toward him. He tried to steady himself, pulled out his phone, and turned on the flashlight, shining it in the direction of the shadow. Nothing. The light seemed to have no effect on that figure, which continued to approach slowly, now emitting a sound that resembled a moan of pain. "I don't believe in ghosts," Ethan muttered to himself, as if repeating it would be enough to keep his growing fear at bay. But something deep within him knew that this time, there was no denying what his eyes were witnessing. His watch showed midnight. A distant bell tolled, echoing across the deserted cemetery. And at that moment, the figure stopped, lifting its head slowly as if it had been waiting for that precise moment. Ethan felt his heart race and, against his will, took a step back. What was he supposed to do? Run? There was nowhere to go. He was alone, surrounded by gravestones and an eerie silence. And that figure, that specter, seemed in no hurry. What did it want? Ethan felt panic rising inside him, but before he could react, the shadow vanished. As if it had never been there. Or was it? Ethan stood frozen, feeling the cold wind whip against his face as he tried to catch his breath. His eyes scanned the cemetery, searching for any sign of the figure, but the fog had swallowed everything. His heart still pounded in his chest, and he didn't know whether to be thankful that the thing had disappeared or afraid it might return at any moment. This can't be happening, he thought, wiping the sweat now forming on his forehead. What he had just witnessed was impossible to explain. He had never believed in the legends surrounding the cemetery, and always laughed off the tales told by younger folks. Just vivid imaginations, he used to say. But after what he had seen, he didn't know what to think anymore. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted his friend and fellow worker, Adam. "Something weird happened here. I think I saw something." He hesitated before sending it, knowing how ridiculous it sounded. He didn't want to seem crazy. Adam quickly replied, "What? A ghost? Ha. Been drinking, Ethan?" The sarcasm in the message only heightened Ethan's unease. Ethan took a deep breath, determined to finish the job and leave as fast as possible. He grabbed the shovel again, trying to focus on the grave in front of him. But something was wrong. As he plunged the shovel into the dirt, he felt resistance. Like something was buried too shallow. Curious, he dug harder, and soon a strange sensation took over him. The soil was too cold, as if it was hiding something that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the shovel struck something solid. Ethan froze. Slowly, he brushed away the dirt with his hands, revealing an old wooden box, worn down by time. The rusty hinges looked ready to fall apart. His curiosity outweighed his fear, and he pried the box open with a soft crack. Inside was an old diary, yellowed and with fragile pages. The name on the cover was faded but still legible: Thomas Grayson. Ethan knew that name. Thomas Grayson was one of the town's earliest settlers, dead for nearly a century. But what was his diary doing buried in a grave that didn't belong to him? As he flipped through the pages, Ethan saw entries that chilled him to the bone. Thomas Grayson wrote of a curse, something that haunted the cemetery. He mentioned apparitions, figures wandering among the graves at night. He described a figure identical to the one Ethan had just seen. But the most terrifying part came at the end. Grayson wrote about a pact, something he did to protect the town, but at a terrible cost. Ethan felt the ground drop from beneath his feet. He glanced around, half expecting to see the specter again. And then he felt it. A presence behind him. His entire body tensed, and he knew, without turning, that he wasn't alone anymore. Ethan couldn't move. The presence behind him was dense, almost tangible, and the air around him felt colder. His breathing became shallow, his muscles tense. Slowly, he turned his head to look over his shoulder. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. The ghostly figure had returned, closer this time, just a few feet away. The figure's features were clearer now. It was a man, or something that had once been a man, dressed in old, tattered clothing. His eyes, however, were an abyss of darkness, void of life. His mouth moved in an inaudible whisper, as if trying to communicate something beyond Ethan's understanding. The diary in Ethan's hands began to tremble, as if reacting to the presence of that figure. "Thomas Grayson?" Ethan whispered, almost unable to believe he was trying to speak to a ghost. The specter stopped moving, fixing its empty eyes on him. Ethan felt sweat trickle down his temple, as a terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if the pact Grayson mentioned in the diary had not been fulfilled? What if that spirit was here, to collect on a debt? Suddenly, Ethan's phone vibrated. The sound cut through the cemetery's eerie silence like a thunderclap. It was Adam, calling him back. With trembling fingers, Ethan answered the call without taking his eyes off the figure in front of him. "Ethan, you okay? Can you hear me?" Adam's voice sounded distant, muffled by the fear enveloping Ethan. He tried to respond, but his voice was stuck in his throat. The specter began to move again, this time faster, its feet hovering above the ground as it advanced toward Ethan. "Adam, there's something here." Ethan finally managed to shout, his own voice surprising him. "I saw a ghost." What would have sounded absurd minutes ago now felt like the only truth he could accept. Adam, laughing on the other end of the line, fell silent as he sensed the panic in Ethan's voice. The figure stopped again, now only a few steps away. Ethan backed up, feeling the cold wind sting his face as the energy around him seemed to vibrate with a dark force. Then, the ghost raised one hand, pointing directly at Ethan's chest. What did it want? What had Ethan done? These questions raced through his mind as a wave of terror washed over him. There was no clear answer. Run? There was nowhere to escape. Fight? How could he fight something that was already dead? The ghost began to speak, but the voice that came out was unnatural. It was rough, deep, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The pact must be fulfilled. The voice echoed through the wind. Ethan froze. What did that mean? What had Grayson done that kept his spirit bound here? I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan stammered, trying to back away further, but tripping over a gravestone behind him. The spirit moved closer, the distance between them disappearing. And then, without warning, the ghost vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there. Ethan stood there, panting, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But before he could gather his thoughts, something on the ground where the ghost had disappeared caught his eye. A small object gleamed in the dirt. A key, old and rusted, but strangely intact. What could it mean? Ethan picked up the key, his hands still shaking, and looked around, trying to make sense of the deepening mystery. But he knew one thing, this was far from over. The cold metal of the key weighed heavily in Ethan's hands. He knew it was a sign. Something was coming, and somehow, he was a part of it. With Grayson's diary and the key now in his possession, Ethan felt compelled to uncover what the spirit wanted him to do. But how? His watch showed 12:15, and the fog around him seemed to grow thicker, smothering any sound but the oppressive silence. Another message from Adam flashed on his phone. "Are you okay? Talk to me." Ethan took a deep breath, deciding not to drag his friend into this nightmare. "I'm fine. Heading out now. I'll call you tomorrow," he quickly typed back, stowing his phone in his pocket as he surveyed the vast cemetery once more. It was as if the dead were watching, waiting for his next move. He didn't know what to do with the key, but instinct led him toward Thomas Grayson's mausoleum, located at the far end of the cemetery. The structure was imposing, with rusted iron gates and stone walls covered in moss. Ethan had never paid much attention to the place, but now, everything seemed to click. The key belonged here. With a dry throat and trembling hands, he approached the gate. The key slid smoothly into the lock, as if it had waited 100 years for this moment. With a loud creak, the door opened, revealing the dark, damp interior of the mausoleum. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but he knew there was no turning back. He had to find out what was hidden there. Inside, the beams of light from his flashlight revealed a small, cramped space with a stone sarcophagus at its center. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, nearly illegible from the wear of time. But one phrase stood out, etched into the marble next to the tomb: "Only he who fulfills the pact will find peace." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He approached the sarcophagus, a strange force guiding his movements. With great effort, he pushed the stone lid, which slid off with a dull thud, revealing the mummified body of Thomas Grayson. Beside the body lay an envelope, sealed with red wax. Ethan picked it up, hesitating for a moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was old, elegant, and spoke of a long-buried secret. In life, Grayson had made a pact with dark forces to protect the town from a looming plague, but in return, he was cursed to watch over the cemetery after his death. His soul had been trapped there, wandering, until someone from the outside would complete the final ritual. Ethan felt sick. He was the final piece of the puzzle. Grayson's spirit had chosen him to end this torment. But what did that mean? What would he have to do? He looked down at the body in the sarcophagus and, in that moment, understood. The key was not just to unlock the mausoleum, it was the key to seal the pact forever. He had to bury it with Grayson, closing the cycle. With trembling hands, Ethan placed the key on the chest of the mummy, reciting the words from the letter like a final farewell. The ground shook slightly, and for a moment, the wind inside the mausoleum howled like a distant scream that finally faded. Ethan knew he had completed the pact. The spirit was at peace. He stepped out of the mausoleum, his heart still racing, but with a strange sense of relief. The fog was beginning to lift, and for the first time that night, he felt the cemetery was truly silent. There were no more presences, only the calm of the dead resting. As Ethan turned to leave the cemetery, his phone vibrated again. Another message from Adam: "You still alive over there?" Ethan smiled, looking back at the gravestones one last time before replying, "Yeah, I'm still here." And with that, he walked away from the cemetery, knowing that night would never be forgotten. Story 4. In the quiet of the cemetery, where the wind whispered between the gravestones and the silence was only occasionally broken by the sound of birds, John, the gravedigger, went about his daily work. He didn't mind the solitude or the furtive glances of the few people who still visited the graves. Since taking the job 10 years ago, he had grown used to the isolation. To him, the graves were like old companions. The latest one, freshly dug that morning, belonged to a young woman whom no one seemed to know. Accident, they said, as they threw the dirt over her coffin. The sun was setting when something changed. A strange sound reached his ears. At first, John thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him, perhaps the wind passing through a hollow tree or some animal sneaking through the shadows. But the sound repeated. A muffled scream. He froze, his muscles stiff with exhaustion, his eyes scanning the horizon. The scream, was it coming from one of the graves? No. Impossible, he thought, his heart beginning to race. John hesitated, but the sound persisted. It came from the freshly covered grave. It was the beginning of a night that would forever change his perception of the world. Something terrible and unexplainable was happening here. John, still paralyzed by uncertainty, felt a chill down his spine as he realized the sound was coming from the grave of the young woman buried earlier that day. The scream was faint, but clear enough that he knew it wasn't his imagination. Gripped by a mix of fear and curiosity, he grabbed his shovel, feeling the cold sweat forming on his brow, and began to dig. Each thrust of the shovel seemed to defy reason, but the desperation in the sound pushed him to continue. The sky, once tinged with orange, had now turned completely dark, and only the faint light of the lantern he had brought with him illuminated the scene. Dirt flew to the sides, and finally, the shovel hit the wood of the coffin. The scream had stopped, and John's breathing became erratic. He placed the lantern beside him and, with trembling hands, opened the coffin. What he saw inside left him breathless. The young woman lay motionless, her eyes closed, exactly as she had been when he buried her. John waited, expecting some movement, some confirmation that she was alive, but nothing happened. "I must be losing my mind," he muttered to himself, feeling like a fool. But as he prepared to close the coffin, something indescribable occurred. The young woman's eyes suddenly opened, but there was no life in them. They were completely white. John stumbled backward, terrified, as she began to mumble something incoherent. He tried to move away, but as if something had pulled him back, he remained there, frozen. The woman continued to mumble, and then, with a voice that seemed to come from a distant and dark place, she said, "You shouldn't be here." The lantern went out at that exact moment, plunging John into suffocating darkness. He heard the sound of the coffin closing, as if the grave itself wanted to seal away what had been disturbed. With his breath coming in shallow gasps, John stood up, fighting the paralyzing fear that gripped him. He stumbled backward, trying to escape, but he felt something invisible watching him, as if the shadows of the cemetery had gained consciousness. Without thinking, he ran, tripping over gravestones, feeling the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing down on him. When he reached the small shack where he kept his belongings, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch his breath. His eyes were wide, and his heart pounded so hard he thought it might explode. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. Still trembling, he pulled it out and looked at the screen. There was a message from an unknown number: "She's not alone. They're watching." John's blood ran cold. How did someone know what had just happened? He glanced out the window and, for a brief moment, thought he saw a figure in the shadows, watching him from afar. The phone slipped from John's hands as he backed away from the window, trying to organize his thoughts. "What is happening?" he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. The message made no sense, or did it? The girl in the coffin, her white eyes, the voice that didn't sound human. And now, an enigmatic message from an unknown number? Nothing felt real, but the fear was too palpable to be a nightmare. John tried to convince himself that it was all a product of exhaustion, of sleepless nights and too many hours spent in solitude at the cemetery. But the persistent chime of a second message brought him back to reality. He looked again at his phone. "Let's go back to the beginning." Look again. Without fully understanding, but terrified of the unknown, John felt an invisible pressure, as if he were being compelled to return to the grave. He wanted to flee, to disappear, but something inside him knew there was no escape. Against all logic, he grabbed his lantern and left the shack, feeling the cold night wind lash against his face. The walk back to the grave felt longer this time, and every shadow seemed to watch him, as if the world around him had twisted into a nightmare. When he reached the grave, what he found was even more disturbing. The coffin, which he had dug up and opened, was exactly as it had been earlier, covered in dirt, as if it had never been touched. "This is impossible," he murmured, feeling his mind split between reality and delirium. He dropped to his knees, touching the earth, and suddenly, his phone vibrated again. Without thinking, he picked it up, and the message was clear: "You need to open it." With a mix of desperation and a defiance of his own sanity, John grabbed the shovel and began to dig frantically for the second time that night. He didn't know what he was doing, but something pushed him, a force beyond his comprehension. When he finally reached the coffin, he hesitated, his hands sweaty and shaking. With a heavy sigh, he lifted the lid, expecting the worst. But this time, the coffin was empty. The shock made him fall back again. He blinked, trying to understand what was happening. "How can this be?" he repeated, looking around as if expecting someone or something to appear and explain what he was witnessing. The silence of the cemetery was oppressive, almost as if the very air had been trapped, waiting. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of his vision. A woman, pale, with long, disheveled hair, slowly walked toward him, emerging from the darkness. John was paralyzed, unable to react. He knew that woman. It was the young girl he had buried. But she no longer looked human. Her white eyes locked onto him as she whispered something. "They are coming. You set them free." John wanted to scream, run, anything, but his body wouldn't respond. He just watched as the figure drew closer and closer until she was so near that he could feel the cold radiating from her. Then, with a voice that echoed through the cemetery, she said, "You must pay for what you've done." John was frozen, unable to move. The figure before him, the young woman he had buried just hours earlier, seemed more like a ghost than a human being. The cold radiating from her was suffocating, and her voice, filled with an ancient pain, echoed in the silence of the night. "You set them free," she repeated, each word carrying a truth that John still couldn't fully comprehend. Now they want you. Finally, with an almost superhuman effort, John managed to move. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding so fast that he thought he might faint. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. Who were they? What had he done? Everything was wrong, as if the world around him had twisted into a nightmare he couldn't escape from. Desperate to keep his sanity, John turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get away. Behind him, the sound of the young woman's footsteps echoed, but they seemed to come from everywhere at once. His breathing became more labored, and he could feel her presence growing closer, as if the very darkness was closing in on him. When he finally reached the cemetery gates, John stopped abruptly. In front of him, a line of figures emerged from the mist. Men, women, children, all with the same white, vacant eyes. All buried by him over the years. Terror gripped him as they silently approached, forming a circle around him. John was trapped. "Why are you here?" he shouted, his voice filled with despair. But no one answered. The only sound he could hear was the rapid beating of his own heart. The silence was worse than any response. Then, the young woman spoke again, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You tampered with what you shouldn't have. We were at peace, but you took us from there." John fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, and finally understood. By opening her coffin, he had disturbed something far older and more powerful than he could ever have imagined. Something that didn't belong in the world of the living but was now free. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know." The young woman knelt before him, her cold eyes staring into his soul. "Now, you belong to them," she said softly, almost with compassion. "Just like us." The cold intensified as the figures closed in on John, their ghostly hands touching his body, slowly draining his life. He tried to fight, but there was no more strength left in him. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the young woman's face, watching him with eerie calm, as she whispered, "Now, you are at peace." John's story ended there, in the same cemetery where he had worked for years. But the graves continued to be filled, and the muffled screams, buried beneath the earth, never ceased. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales, and share it with someone you know who also loves a dark mystery. And remember, sometimes, it's better to leave the dead undisturbed.